most important right that trans people can advocate for is the right to self-expression, because there's a lot of people who I think are just not going to be convinced that trans women are women in any kind of philosophic or objective way, any kind of biological way. I mean, that's kind of a given, but there's a lot of people who are not going to be convinced that you should take a non-biological definition of womanhood. That experience of being so alien in an environment that has just never dealt with someone like you before forced me, I think, to get very good at making my identity and existence compatible with people who did not understand and we're coming into it with a negative perception.
Yeah. What do you mean by that? Can you elaborate?
I can. So I didn't ever do the thing where someone gets your pronouns wrong and you kind of berate them. I just didn't have the luxury of doing that because I wouldn't have anyone on my side. My only option was just to try to pass better. And I couldn't explain to people my experience in a way that would they just didn't have the cultural knowledge to immediately get it. And so I had to make sacrifices and negotiate from a position of weakness. I had to understand that many people would see me as male. In addition to seeing me as male, they'd see me as just kind of like weird. And so I couldn't demand things of people. I couldn't demand pronouns, but I also couldn't demand access to women's sports teams or bathrooms or whatever. I had to persuade people just through trying to meet them where they're at. And I think that mindset has really carried over, where today I'm very cognizant of what gender critical and TERFy and conservative people view when they look at trans people. I'm very cognizant of that. And I'm very aware of how I can present myself in a way that they're going to find acceptable. I think that people who don't like me would even maybe say that I'm aware of this to a neurotic degree, where I'm kind of I've tailored some of my existence in such a way as to, not offend these people. So that mindset of just being aware of what people think of me, very aware, and trying not to step on toes has very much informed a lot of my approach to transition.
That's really interesting that you mentioned that. Would you say that you try to conform, for lack of a better word, to I don't want to say right-leaning people, but the groups you mentioned I would primarily categorize as right-leaning. Are you living the way that you do in terms of the way you dress or the way you act socially, etc., because you want to not step on their toes? Or is it because you I guess I'm asking, is it fear-based or
Well, I think it's difficult to fully entangle. I would say that from my perspective, it's more about awareness of how these people perceive the world and how I come across to them, rather than trying to live up to their expectations or conform myself to their desires. And it's a tricky distinction, right? But here's an example. I think that the most important right that trans people can advocate for is the right to self-expression, because there's a lot of people who I think are just not going to be convinced that trans women are women in any kind of philosophic or objective way, any kind of biological way. I mean, that's kind of a given, but there's a lot of people who are not going to be convinced that you should take a non-biological definition of womanhood. And given that, I think you position yourself from a much greater point of power to argue that you have a right to self-expression that is fundamental in some way to all human rights. And I think that when you tell someone like that, like a TERF who believes that trans women will never be women, you say, okay, I'm not going to argue with you on that, but I am going to argue that I have a right to do with my body what I will, and I have a right to do with my expression what I will. And I don't necessarily have a right to every space in society associated with women, but fundamentally, I have a right to my body. I think that's a much stronger argument, and I think that's really an argument that gets more closely to the core of what actually matters for trans women. So I think it's persuasive inclusive and it's more to the core, to the heart of the issue. And the reason I'd make that argument is because I have a kind of special awareness of what TERFs are thinking, what gender critical people are thinking, what conservatives are thinking. And I understand from growing up that like, I can't convince everyone that I'm a girl. I can't do that, okay? But what I can do is I can dress and act and make myself look as feminine as I can so that when their brain reaches for a pronoun, it reaches for she and her. That's what I have control over.
Yeah.
And I can go to these people and I can say, listen, we both agree on some fundamental values, freedom of expression, ability to control what your body does. And then I can make that argument. So I don't feel like I'm beholden to these people, but I do feel like there's a kind of tactical way to approach negotiating for your rights. And it's informed by my experiences growing up in a rural area.
Yeah.